I'm going to ask you a question set you can prepare for now, but I'll also talk about some stuff. But just before we leave, I'm going to ask you, if you go back, whoever you go back to, whether or not your loved ones or your colleagues, or maybe your colleagues are your loved ones, and you're going to say the one thing, you're going to say, we should think about ... What is that ... If there is any new things that you should think about. I'm not going to ask you now. Have a little think. Let that percolate through your head whilst I try, oh my God, to try and break down what's happened today. Well, if you were in the same room as I was today, then you saw a number of different talks, of which I have tried to sort of capture here. We started off with the mayor. It's always good to start with the mayor, who I thought was really on target, actually. It's great, isn't it, to have a sort of political person actually talking about the very thing that we're supposed to be doing, which is great. It's quite refreshing. And the mayor and Carsten came along, and they did talk about growth, didn't they? They talked about this 25% growth, and there was proof, because we had the newspapers, so that proves it. And that's great. So there was this very strong impetus about how important the creative industries are, how important Aarhus is, and about how we're all together and we're not fighting Copenhagen, which is exciting. Then we went to someone who's suffering from minus 20% growth, which was DR, which I thought was rather apt. So there's this 5% there somewhere for somebody, which is great. And so we went to Johanna Bagger from DR, and Johanna's speech, I get the lucky job right here, because I get to sum up at the end, and none of them can fight back, can they? So I could say anything, so it doesn't make it right. But there was a thing mentioned many years ago when we had one of these like Live Aid. You remember Live Aid? If you knew about it in the UK, huge big event back in the 80s. Then we have the second version, and there was a journalist, and he said, we used to have movements and now we have moments. So like the 60s, the civil rights movement, the 60s and the 70s, feminism, we had these movements and they took 10, 15, 20 years. Now we have moments where you get these sharp spikes like the Me Too campaign. Now, we're all hoping that that has a long-lasting effect, but you have these sharp spikes. So we've moved from movements to moments, and I think that was something that I felt. I'm going to take my glass off again. I can't read the hell I'm writing here. And I think that's something that came out of, for me at least, it was interesting that you talked about this notion of shouting one thing at a time. Clearly you're very value-driven, because you're a public service broadcaster, so we can see the whole value system coming in there as a kind of as a rationale for why you do what you do. You touched upon this sort of play versus addiction. I think there are deeper questions that have to be asked within that space, because I don't know whether or not the distinction is clear enough for anybody. I mean, some kid might get totally addicted to Bamse and cooling, desperately trying to find. I would have done. I wanted to play it. So I think there were two words that came out of this, and I've noticed I've got a theme going here, which is the words beginning with the letter R. There was retention and relevance. I think they were the key words that sort of came out of it for me, this notion that things have to be relevant, and there is this question of retention, and I'm fascinated by the shift in focus that you have to take from being a content producer to a content publisher, and whether or not the commissioners are relinquishing strategy to you, if they're doing it in a positive way, or if they're like doing it through gritted teeth. I don't know. Yelena from Kids Industries, who I think unfortunately has to leave, probably catch a flight, talked very much about the power of voice. Fascinating. A lot of the stuff that they showed I didn't know existed. Also introduced this notion of the hierarchy of play. There was an interesting slide that went past quite quickly, which was the idea that kids would prefer to play with each other, then they prefer to play with a robot, and then they prefer to play by themselves. I think that's fascinating. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, yes, what do we give access to? Because if we give access to robots easier than we give access to their friends, then they will play with robots, even if actually, at the end of the day, they prefer playing with their friends. My son, I'm sure, would prefer much more to play with his friends, but he spends 12 hours a day on YouTube. So it's a very interesting question, this discussion about what do they prefer? Yes, but what do they have access to? And I think this is something fundamental that we have to ask. For me, I think it brought out the question of the role of the parent. I mean, this whole thing, and this is very much, I must be getting this, one because I'm a parent, and one because I'm now half Danish, maybe a third, I don't know. But I think there was this big question about the role of the parents, and I think I could sense that in the room when you could see these devices. It was pretty scary, that whole courtroom scene at the end. But let's see where that goes. I thought what was fascinating was this distinction, the way in which different children view clever. I mean, that's fascinating. The way in which different children thought different things were clever. So, and that's what kids industries are extremely good at. It's kind of profiling. I question some of their profiling, but I think it's a very interesting starting point for discussion. Although later on in the day, I think Rega actually dismissed the notion of sort of age profiling, which I think is cool. Then we have our friend Frederik, and I think Frederik, I think you shifted from Mads Mikkelsen to Kim Bodnia during your talk. If that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. It's a good thing, okay? So you played the classic naughty Dane, and that's what Danes do. That's what you do. I've always said that the Scandinavian family is that the Dane is the last born, it's the naughty child. The Swede is the firstborn, it's the rule-based one. Norway is the kid sitting in its room, nobody knows what it's doing. Iceland is that weird cousin that you only see at weddings and you go, are they family? And Finland, I mean, I didn't know that my father fucked Russia. But anyway, so, oh, I hope that's not live. So in a way, for me, you did that thing of playing the naughty boy, the naughty Dane, and interesting enough, what I find fascinating is this kind of, I'm mixing metaphors here, this kind of Jekyll and Hyde role that you're playing, which is, in some ways, you're recognizing how important it is to be very creative, and yet I think, I could be wrong here, that having now left DR and setting up your own company, you're having to be more critically thinking, because you're probably realizing you're having to be more persuasive in your arguments when working and getting money, basically, because it's not like the cushy old days when you worked in the DR and somebody said, right, who's going to make something funny? Oh, there's Frederik around, you know. So I find that interesting, particularly as a freelancer, the way in which sometimes, and there's a gentleman at the back who's asked about 18 questions today. He works for a small company. I think there's 3 of them in his company. It's obvious why he's got lots of questions, because he needs money, he needs to survive. So I think it's very interesting, not only are we thinking about children, but we're thinking about the culture of the industries in which we work and how that affects. I think there's always a thing that always happens with Johnny Foreigner is the distinction we make between fun and funny. And it's an interesting thing, and that's often just it's a language-based thing, and it's a cultural question. How are we doing? Oh my God, getting there. Right. So then we went to Peter Carlson from Sweden, who's the firstborn, clearly. And you. Oh, sorry. The art. Okay. Well, that's first child Swede, an only child Swede. That's really right. Reductive. That's your R word for Frederik. Reductive, because I thought it was very interesting about this notion of reducing things and whether or not you derive value. Whereas I think, Petter, you showed responsibility in a very, very positive way. I would say you became Sophia Helin, is that her name? The actress that played against Kid Bodnia in The Bridge. So you brought this questioning role, which I think is absolutely essential, and I think actually you've really focused the mind, you've focused my mind on some very important things, and you brought this question of diversity, as we'd always expect from the Swede. But it's a very, very, very important question. Comic relief, you have a similar thing here in Denmark. There was a thing years ago where people started asking the question, can people really give money anymore to comic relief to dying children in Africa or whatever? And there was this great word, compassion fatigue. And I remember seeing this comedian, Billy Colony, who I don't think that's funny, he's that funny, but he was talking about, compassion fatigue, as if there's a certain point in the life where you just, sorry, I've used up all my compassion, I can no longer be more compassionate. And there was an interesting question, I don't know if it was from you, madam, but this idea of how far can we go with diversity? And for me, that's the same thing. And like how far? There is no limit. I mean, we just have to keep going. We just have to keep going. It was one of the biggest shocks. I'm sorry, but when I came to Denmark, I was like, whoa, where's the diversity stuff that I had back in lovely politically correct England, And I believe in political correctness. But anyway, so I think it's a very, very important role that you played, and I'm very glad that you played Sophia Helin in the role that you did. And you brought this notion of responsibility. Then we had Joshua and Paul, who took us through a very fascinating route through the evolution of platforms. And I thought that this distinguishing between data and personal info, which is probably their bread and butter. But for us, was like, oh yeah, that's an interesting distinction. Maybe it's your bread and butter, I don't know. It's kind of scary what they talk about, clearly, but they're here to slightly scare us, because it's a bit like those people that tell you about terrible fires that rage in buildings and say, but we've got the best smoke detector you can buy. So I understand, but I he's laughing, but I recognise that the scariness is about, I suppose, adhering. If you're going to adhere to these rules, it's bloody complicated, and therefore you need people. I mean, lawyers make money when it rains and it shines, right? So I always think lawyers are a bit like locksmiths that sell you really good locks and then sell you really crap keys, and then keep telling you that you have to buy new keys to work with the locks. But anyway, I think there's something very interesting, and I noticed that Paul used this R word, retention, again, and return on investment, which I think he was the only person in the room, and maybe Joshua, talk about return on investment, which I imagine a lot of you are interested in. So we had retention and return on investment, we've had responsibility, productive, we've had retention and relevance. So then we had Mass and Riga, sorry, my Danish. That was great, wasn't it? The little bout we had here, a bit constructed for the cameras, okay, I admit. And so I think we had this notion of rationale and right hook, I would say, as my two R words. There was a very interesting notion of anarchy versus control, but it certainly challenged me, and it challenged me in two ways. It challenged me as a parent, because all too often I feel like I'm way too constrained to my children, and I often think that frameworks are the way in which they can push boundaries, but I think actually there is a lot to learn about the way in which we allow anarchy to be in that space, which I think you Danes are extremely good at in terms of the content you produce. But it also challenged me from my old role when I was teaching design for a couple of years, and I did embrace the double diamond. Always sounds like a drink, doesn't it? I'll have a pint of double diamond, please. But I think that there's something very interesting about this thing, and I don't know whether Rega was just simply pushing the theoretical line with no responsibility to the practice, and then Paul Massa's like going, yeah, but you fucking try and teach that, right? Or whether or not there's a genuine sense that this can really work. And I would love to see how these two approaches would actually come together. And I'm sure that they do in many ways. I think really it's often about the relationship between critical and creative thinking, but who knows. And then Brad, right at the very end, who's graced us all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. I love saying that. I love this idea that giving them a home, giving characters a home. And what I also find fascinating by his talk is this level of how sometimes there are some people in the industry extremely good at trying to help others to navigate within the industry, and there are some people who are complete arseholes at not. And it's not necessarily because those people that don't are all arseholes, it's just often because they can't necessarily articulate why certain things work in certain places. I think his role is being able to sort of deconstruct the no in the rejection letter and to explain it and to take it further. I'm fascinated to know whether or not you have some sort of PDF that you've produced and you send out to everybody afterwards, which sort of says, read this and you might understand. But I suppose there was a lovely thing that was pointed at you, Christian, earlier about this notion of sharing, and today's very much about sharing, and about the benefits of sharing within an industry in order to for capacity building and to make people smarter. So I very much I'm very curious about how Cartoon Network does embrace your mentality for actually helping indies to be able to produce better games, both in both games and computer space, IP within games and IP within animation. You talked about whoever's worked out the rules of comedy, we could make $1 million. You just need to watch Jacques Tati. I mean, he's worked it out. Jacques Tati, he is the genius of which Mr. Bean pays homage to. Jacques Tati was the guy that basically did actually make a jug bounce, as you used as your example. So, oh my God, I'm just over, but I'm just going to ask the quick question then. So, who dares tell me, when you go back to your loved ones and your colleagues and the colleagues you love, and you say to them, we should think about, what is it you're going to say? Who dares? So, diversity? Anybody else? Alexa? Please stop. Yes. Anybody else? Dare? Ethics?
dedicated lawyer with a GDPR focus.
Just go to Paul and Joshua. Yes, anybody else? No, silence. Safety. Okay. Well,
duality of both the room that kids need to feel safe, to have fun.
A place for kids to play safe and to be fun. Well, listen. I think there's so much of today. It's got to percolate through the system, hasn't it, and allow you to go away and think about it. I think the best thing you could do is enjoy yourselves here, talk to each other, and make sure that the people who organise this know in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks' time, when you suddenly realise just how damn valuable today was, that you're grateful to them. So give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much.